Shabbat Shalom. This morning we want to begin with a prayer of thanksgiving as we're remembering Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has kept us in life and sustained us and allowed us to witness the restoration of our people Israel to the land which you promised to our forefathers and to their children forever. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu nidchei amo Yisrael. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who gathers the dispersed of your people Israel. So today, obviously, we're talking about Israel, and specifically Israel's prophetic future. As we look back, for us, 1948 stands out as one of our finest hours. This was the fulfillment of nearly 2,000 years of Jewish prayers and dreams. Tiny, beleaguered Israel heroically stood up to the vastly superior forces of 5 neighboring Arab nations as we struggled for our right to exist as a sovereign state. This war would never have had to be fought if our neighbors had been willing to accept a united international decision, as we were willing to do. Despite everything, we saw the rebirth of our hopes of 2,000 years, an independent Jewish state arising once more on the mountains of Israel. Arabs called the war of 1948 Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. They and their revisionist friends describe this as the occasion when colonizing Zionists, with their international collaborators, expelled thousands, hundreds of thousands of Arabs from their homes and turned them into refugees. They conveniently forget that the surrounding Arab nations forcibly evicted nearly 1 million Jews from homes and businesses they would never see again, and for which there would be no reparations and no long-standing victim status, as with the so-called Palestinians, many of whom had lived in the area fewer than 2 or 3 years. Unlike the Arabs, many of whom left the area voluntarily, with promises from their brothers of a quick return and additional land, the Jews evicted from Arab states mostly found a new home in Israel and made a new life for themselves. Arab refugees, the only people who are allowed by the UN to carry this status onward for generations, have been kept in camps by their own Arab people instead of being allowed to become citizens of other Arab states or of the states that their families came from, quite recently in many cases. History and archaeology confirm that there has been a continuous Jewish presence in the land of Israel since the days of Yeshua, that is around 1360 BCE, before the Common Era. At times, our presence was small, and we were persecuted and terribly impoverished, but we have always been there. In the 1800s, wealthy Jews from the West, like the Rothschilds and the Montefiore family, began to buy land from Ottoman Turk owners. Much of the land was completely vacant. It was desolate, or it was swamp, of no use to anyone for any particular purpose, with nothing much growing anywhere. The goal of these visionaries was to bring Jews, especially the impoverished, persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe, to settle and rebuild the land. In other words, it was to bring a people without a land to a land without a people. Jews living miserable lives in the Ukraine, in Russia, in Poland. These were the Jews that they aimed for, and they were encouraged to return to Israel. Livnot yetibanot, to build and to be built up, to build up our country, and at the same time to build ourselves into a new kind of Jew, not a ghetto Jew, not a yeshiva bocher, or a pale-faced, downtrodden ghetto dweller who was forced to accept whatever the king or the emperor or other rulers or even the people around them devised for them, but a farmer and a builder, working the land with a plow in one hand and, if necessary, a gun in the other. Jews were given great hope by the 1917 Balfour Declaration, issued in the UK, which some are trying now to repeal, or even worse, to apologize for. This declaration affirmed His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Well, only 5 years later, the 1922 White Paper, also called, interestingly, the Churchill White Paper, issued on June 3rd of that year, was the first official manifesto interpreting and, in effect, reinterpreting the Balfour Declaration, following investigation of the so-called 1921 disturbances. Called disturbances, but actually what they were attacks on Jews by Arabs. Although the White Paper stated that the Balfour Declaration could not be amended and that the Jews were in Palestine by right, in effect, it did actually amend the Balfour Declaration because it partitioned the area east of the Jordan River away from any further Jewish settlement and without any international authorization from anybody, yet no one protested. And that land, which was 76% of what is called Palestine, or the Palestine Mandate, was renamed Transjordan. And it was given to Emir Abdullah ibn al-Hussein, who was born in Mecca, the second son of Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif and Emir of Mecca. Supposedly, it was given to this man for his services to the British during World War I. But the primary reason was to keep peace in Arabia between warring families, the warring families being the Al-Husseins and the Saudi family. And of course, we know that Saudi Arabia is now ruled by the Saudi family, and Jordan, a created country, is still ruled by the Al-Hussein family. In the late 1930s, as anti-Semitism spread over Europe, Britain categorically refused to allow open immigration of beleaguered Jews to our ancestral home, the land they had said we had a right to be in. Before, during, and after the Shoah, Jews were frustrated by the steadfast British intransigence and hardness of heart. By 1947, after the Shoah, there were 600,000 Jews living peacefully in the land of Israel. They were living on land that had been legally acquired by the Jewish agency, mostly from absentee Turkish landlords. Most of the Arabs living there had come after 1900 from the surrounding countries of Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, and even Arabia itself. They had emigrated in response to the opportunity for jobs that was opened up by Jewish entrepreneurship and energy. In other words, before the Jews were there would have been no reason for these people to move to the area. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition what was left of Palestine, 24% of the original mandate, into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. Now, to my mind, they already had an Arab state. It was called Jordan, and it occupied 76% of the original land. This would have meant that the tiny Jewish state without Jerusalem, with borders virtually impossible to defend, well, that's what we would have gotten. But we accepted this UN proposal. The Arabs unanimously rejected it. They wanted all the land and no Jews. In May of 1948, the formation of a Jewish state in accordance with the UN's vote was announced. The first deaths of the conflict, which wouldn't have needed to occur at all, happened on the 30th of November, 1947, during the Arab ambush of 2 buses carrying Jews. The Arabs, completely rejecting the UN proposal, were aided and abetted by the departing British. The British callously did not believe Israel could survive, and so turned everything they could, armaments, property, over to the Arabs. Through fierce determination, lack of any other choices, and God's intervention, Israel defeated the numerically superior and much better equipped forces of 5 Arab nations arrayed against her, including Jordan, trained by the British. We can surely say that in that day, God fought for us. Arab leaders encouraged their people to leave the combat area so as not to interfere with Arab soldiers seeking to push the Jews into the sea, which Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt publicly declared was their intent. The vast majority of Arabs left because they wanted to, and because they were promised more land, the land owned by Jews. Victorious Israel wanted nothing more than to live in peace with her neighbors, but the Arabs belligerently refused to accept the state of Israel. Thus, the myth of the refugees forced from their homes by Jews. These so-called Palestinians, a name Yasser Arafat began to use for the first time in 1964, you can see it in their materials, in their charter materials. These people are not indigenous, but came from surrounding Arab nations. With no historical right to this land, Arabs before the time of Muhammad, between 570 and 632 was when he lived in, well, Arabia. But they have repeatedly rejected reasonable offers for a state of their own, remaining committed to the complete destruction of Israel and the destruction of the Jewish people universally. Our God, not the UN, nor the British, nor the Americans, God himself is the guarantor of Israel's physical and spiritual restoration. In the book of Yirmiyahu, chapter 31, verses 27 through 34, we read these words. The days are coming, says the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and Yehudah, and I will put my Torah in their inward parts and write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they need not teach one another, and every man his brother, to know the Lord. They will all know me, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. In Zechariah 12, verses 10 through chapter 13, verse 1, we read these words. Then I will pour out the spirit of grace and prayer on all the people of Jerusalem, and they will look on him whom they pierced, and mourn for him as for an only son, and grieve bitterly for him as for an oldest child who died. At that time a fountain will be opened to the people of Israel and Jerusalem, a fountain to cleanse all their sins and defilement. The physical resurrection of the nation of Israel is also the beginning of a spiritual renewal and revival, of which we are an important part. Although the traditional Jewish community finds many Jews apparently uninterested in God or in faith of any kind as a result of the Shoah and secularism, the growth of faith in Mashiach Yeshua among Jewish people has in fact expanded. The initial thrust of this movement was the missionary activity directed from Britain and the U.S. towards many people groups in the 1800s and early 1900s. It has also been Jews who have been determined to share our biblical faith in the Jewish Mashiach Yeshua with our people, resulting before the 1940s in thousands of European Jews coming to believe that Yeshua is the promised Mashiach. In the late 1960s, a revolutionary spiritual awakening took place in the United States, largely among young people of university age. Many Jews were part of this grassroots movement. Led by God's Ruach, His Spirit, these Jewish young people chose not to assimilate and allow themselves to be forced to become part of Christianity, as had those who had gone before them. They were inspired to establish their own Jewish identity and faith in a congregational movement led by Jews. They returned to biblical practices and centuries-old traditions, making no apology for Jewish worship and Torah observance as the appropriate framework for faith in the Jewish Mashiach. Following this pattern, the return continues and is now seen many from among the nations claim their right to be true adopted sons and daughters of Abraham, entering the covenant relationship with God through the Mashiach and by following God's commandments as Jews by choice. Even when some take what we might consider backward steps away from our heritage, we know that God's purposes will advance with those who choose to follow Him fully and faithfully. Despite everything that humanly and demonically opposes the work of God, Hashem prevails, and His promises will come to full fruition. God said in Zechariah 12, 3 through 9, I will make Jerusalem and Yehudah like a cup of poison to all the nearby nations that send their armies to surround Jerusalem. But He promises Israel His deliverance. The Lord will defend the people of Jerusalem, for my plan is to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. God will deal with all the nations that come against Israel, who attempt to destroy, belittle, or berate Israel, and he will fulfill all his promises to our people and to the world. Now, the world at present is faced with possible disasters, including so-called global warming and other natural phenomena, economic chaos and collapse, and deadly pandemic diseases. But the greatest and most imminent threat to the world is war in the Middle East, likely to be started by either Iran or Syria. This war, unleashed against Israel, would have the potential to devastate the whole world. Such a war would undermine the social, political, economic, and religious aspects of world society as we know it today. It may be conducted by fanatical Islamic forces and their determined ultimate purpose to assume total world domination. But wait, consider what has been happening in the last 10 years. Although Islam desires to present itself as a religion of peace, it is actually a religious and political ideology with megalomaniac ambitions. Since its inception, Muhammad and his Allah have planned to transform the world into an international enclave of Islam. Islam literally means, perhaps you've never heard this, submission to the will of Allah. Allah is not another name for the God of the Scriptures. He is in fact Hasatan, the destroyer, chosen by Muhammad from among the many deities his people worshipped originally. Hasatan is the real power behind the Islamic plan, and the only power that can withstand and defeat him is the God of Israel. No human political power can defeat the determined objective of Islam or stop its forward march as it conquers nations, not by war, but by assimilatory conquest, feeding upon the weak, which Muslims see as their destiny. Only the authority of the one true God can achieve victory over the principality of Allah, the God of this world. Zechariah predicted this war some 2,500 years ago, but he also prophesied that in its aftermath, the long-awaited Jewish Mashiach would appear again to Israel. This miraculous appearance will totally transform Israel and subsequently introduce a new era of peace and prosperity as Mashiach reigns over the whole earth. God's glorious light will arise over Jerusalem, and all the nations will recognize that God's presence is there. This horrendous clash of ideologies is inevitable, just as all the representatives of Hasatan have always warred with the people of Hashem. Yet many seemingly intelligent people, religious leaders like the Pope, and political leaders like Angela Merkel, are unwilling to acknowledge this. Political correctness dictates that we should not even speak of such things unless we might offend. But it's absolutely foolish to capitulate to such ideas, leaving us totally unprepared for events that we already see happening and which will forever change the world in which we live. Here are some other events to watch for. False prophets of every kind, a prelude to the false Messiah. Wars. More people have been killed in warfare than at any other time. Devastating weapons of mass destruction are now available, and for the first time in human history, we have the capacity to destroy ourselves. Famine is a constant in Africa, especially in places like Ethiopia and the Sudan, and a large portion of the world's 5 billion people are undernourished. Earthquakes. The number and intensity of earthquakes is at a level higher than at any other time in history. By contrast, in the years 1890 to 1900, there was only one major earthquake in the world. Mattatyahu 24:8 says that all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. COVID-19 has made the whole world painfully aware of how fragile human beings really are and how easily we are overwhelmed by an outside force. We will see an increase in the intensity and severity of these indicators, as when the contractions of a pregnant woman grow stronger as the delivery approaches. Fulfillment of prophecy has always had certain requirements that we should look for the end of days. One of these is the existence of a 200 million man army in the East, and a possibly less than benign desire for world domination. According to Hittakalut, that's the book of Revelation, this is a prerequisite for the end of days. And I can tell you that at no time in history has an army of this size existed until the Chinese army reached that figure in the 1960s. Another is the redevelopment of the Roman Empire. Read Daniel chapter 2, verses 32 and 33, 40 through 43 for yourself. The toes of iron may be the original 10-member nations of the European Economic Community formed in the 1970s. The clay is a second tier of member nations, but we know how unstable clay is, easily breaking apart, chipping, etc. The nations of Europe, since the Roman Empire dissolved, have never adhered or formed one empire, although there was something called the Holy Roman Empire for a while. But they've continued as separate nations or nation groups, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Turkish Empire, and so on, until Benelux, the European Common Market, and now the EU. Is Brexit the beginning of the end for the EU, or just the beginning of something more ominous? Another prerequisite was the restoration of one pure language, Hebrew, to Israel. Zephaniah 3:9 says, "For then I will return to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent." Prior to the restoration of the nation of Israel, Hebrew was the language of the synagogue only. It was officially a dead language like Latin, with several variations: Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi. Yiddish was the language spoken by most Jews 120 years ago. But God revived the Hebrew language through one man, Eliezer ben Yehuda, along with the revival of his people, and the two are inseparable. We're told that a new temple will be built in Jerusalem. This is not the temple that will be built for God's presence to inhabit during the reign of Mashiach on earth, which is described by the prophet Yechezkel. In fact, Daniel 9:26 offers blueprints for this temple. They are ready, and there are several possible scenarios that might make building possible. Miracles and persuasion by the false Messiah and his prophet could convince the Islamic world to approve the rebuilding side by side with the Mosque of Omar. Some archaeologists believe that actually the Temple Mount is 340 feet south of what is called the Dome of the Rock, this site where the Mosque of Omar is built. If this is proven true, the building could begin any time. The court that is left out in the description refers to the building of the temple around the Dome of the Rock. If you look at Hittigalut 11:2, leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, that is the Goyim, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. After God's supernatural destruction of Gog and Magog, which may or may not be nations to the north, possibly Russia, which may be also Islamic armed forces, combined with Russia, worship and zeal amongst Jewish people might encourage the reconstruction of this temple. Many are impressed with a group in Israel called the Temple Mount Faithful, who have now obtained or created all of the clothing, the instruments, and the other equipment required for temple worship, even consecrating Kohanim, although, to be honest, no one can know their lineage today. And they've made repeated attempts to lay the cornerstone of a new temple. There's also the appearance of a red heifer. According to Bamidbar 19:2-7, speak to the sons of Israel that they may bring an unblemished red heifer in which to note there is no defect, and on which a yoke has never been placed. You shall give it to Eleazar the Cohen, and it shall be brought outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. It's believed that a red heifer is required for the waters of purification. Well, in May 1997, the first red heifer was born in, as far as we know, 2,000 years. Another necessary event was the return of Jews from the lands of the north. Yirmiyahu 23, therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when you will no longer say, as the Lord lives who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives who brought up and led back the descendants of the household of Israel from the northland and from all the countries where I have driven them. They will live on their own soil. In the 1970s and 80s, a mass exodus of Russian Jews to Israel surprised everyone, possibly not the least of all the Russian government that allowed them to emigrate. Russian Jews are now the largest single ethnic group in Israel. Also, an increase in information and travel. Daniel 12:4, but as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. Did you know that more discoveries have been made since 1900 than in all of human history combined? 90% of all the engineers or scientists who have ever lived are alive today. To view the increase of information now, one has only to look at the internet. To observe the extent of travel outside of this period of pandemic, visit Heathrow Airport any day of the week and witness flights to every point of the globe. Another important point is the return of the Jews of Ethiopia. Zephaniah 3:10, from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, my dispersed ones, will bring my offerings. In 1984 and 1991, with the aid of the USA, airlifts returned Ethiopian Jews to Israel after thousands of years of exile and persecution. Today, nearly all Ethiopian Jews have been restored to their own land, with the exception of some who believe Yeshua is Mashiach and those who have been assimilated but are still acknowledged as of Jewish descent. There is instant communication around the world. In Hittigalut, Revelation, we read, "And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. When they have finished their testimony, the beast comes up out of the abyss and will make war with them, and overcome them and kill them, and their bodies will lie in the street. Those from the nations and tribes and tongues and nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days." Modern communication would provide a window for people everywhere to view these events, something that was impossible before the mid-20th century, but which is now commonplace. In fact, events taking place anywhere can be viewed universally in real time. What does God say about these things? In Luke 21:28, Rav Yeshua declares, "When these things begin to take place, straighten up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." What should our reaction be to when we see these things taking place? God is telling us that we should not be fearful, but we should trust in Him, in the knowledge that our deliverance is near. Rav Yeshua tells us to stand up and lift up our heads, because our redemption is near. What does that mean? God is our Redeemer. He has promised the redemption of Israel and of all those who are part of the nation and people of Israel by faith. Redemption comes from the return of Mashiach Yeshua. Our people will cry, "Baruch haba b'shem Adonai." Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, just as Zechariah tells us. And they will know their Mashiach as if they'd always known him. Yes, we know that calamitous events will continue to take place before that, but we should be prepared, prayerfully encouraging one another daily as we tick off the events yet to come before the end. And we should rise each day believing that God has everything in hand, including the lives of each one of us. Yov declared, "As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes will see, and not another." Our future glory will overwhelm any terrors that might come first, and which should not terrify us. King Mashiach will rule, and he will reign, aided by those who have been faithful to him in this life. Israel will be fully liberated from the power of her enemies. Most importantly, Israel will be fully revived, restored, spiritually renewed, physically renewed. Physical and spiritual revival and restoration will culminate in the return of the visible presence of God, his Shekinah, his glory, to his people and to the temple which will be built for the reign of King Mashiach, described in the book of Yechezkel. All Israel will be redeemed and restored, not just a remnant as in the past. God will truly be the God of Israel, and Israel will truly be the people of God. God has an eternal relationship with the physical nation and people of Israel, including both natural and adopted children of Abraham, Jews by birth and Jews by choice. According to Yechezkel 44, those uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh will have no part in the worship of God in his holy temple. The uncircumcised, by their act of remaining uncircumcised, demonstrate that they reject and do not honor and obey God and his commandments. Faithfulness to God will be rewarded, as exemplified by God's choice of the descendants of Zadok as Kohanim Hagodalim, that is, the high priest in the Mashiach's Mikdash. Finally, with all these things in mind, how should we live our lives today? We should reconsecrate our lives so that we will be found faithful. God knows who serves him. Those who refrain from worldly desires and experiences, those who do not allow themselves to be led astray by false teachers or teachings, heresies, apostasy, even when that is the direction the majority of people choose to take. Our worship must be God-centered. Just as the temple without the presence of God was empty, so our worship is empty if we do not enter into God's presence with pure hearts, undefiled by the world and its desires, cleansed by the blood of Mashiach Yeshua, sanctified unto mitzvot and mishpatim. For that which we do to have real value, it must be done with the proper motivation and attitude. Worship, service to God, faithfulness, providing for God's servants, these must be done because we love God and seek to please him, and not for any ulterior motives. Let us look to the future for ourselves and our people with the assurance that comes from trusting God fully and believing that which he has planned for us is beyond anything that we can even imagine. May our Mashiach return, and may it be soon. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.